continuation of the recollections by members of Ouspensky's circle, which might be of use for the Yale brochure meetings. Several of those who attended his discussion groups in London and New York, or who are still with us, have said that what impressed them even more than his knowledge was his strength of character. He was like a rock to which one could hitch one's boat. This inspired confidence, as did the absence of showmanship, much speaking, and clearly a search for truth above all things. We'd be waiting for him in the lecture room, and he'd be in his chair almost before we knew he'd arrived. Then, looking round benignly, he would say, "Well?" If no questions came, he would either go on sitting indefinitely or go out of the room and tell somebody to get the conversation going. When answering questions, he seemed to have his knowledge laid out in front of his mind, would pick that part of it which applied to the question and particularly to the questioner. For identical questions might receive different answers according to who was asking. He was always very sensitive to the character of the people who were present. An appropriate aphorism, story, or illustration would come with the answer, as if spontaneously. For example, more than once he said, "We must give up our suffering," pointing out that pain is physical and is often unavoidable, while suffering is psychological, chiefly self-produced. Like man, he said, who was sitting by the road with tears streaming down his face, eating red peppers. When people asked him why he did that, he said, between sobs, "I'm punishing the man who bought these red peppers." That's what we do when we enjoy our suffering. Once someone asked him if there is a real devil. If God exists, does the devil exist too? He said, "Devil, if he exists, is small and vulgar. We create him. But some people, like Milton in Paradise Lost, make a grand big Satan out of him, thus giving him power that he doesn't deserve." There was a monk who was supposed to be keeping the Lenten fast. One day the abbot suddenly entered his cell and caught him boiling an egg over a candle. The monk turned very red and stammered, "It wasn't me, your worship. It was the devil put it into my mind." Out jumped the devil from behind the samovar and cried, "You're a better liar even than me. I never knew you could boil an egg over a candle till you showed me." Another thing people testify to was his unpretentiousness. He never made any claims for himself, and he was not afraid to say, "I don't know," or "We know very little yet." This and the fact that he was not afraid of silences, from which he said good questions often arose. Full stop. For a writer and newspaper man, this was remarkable. he had trained himself very assiduously to use as few words as possible. One discovered this when he was dictating a letter for one to send, for instance. One time he showed me how he did it. He wrote a sentence out, such as, there will be a meeting in this room next Monday at 8 o'clock for you to come and hear more. Then he would cross out word after word until just 2 words remained. Monday, 8 o'clock. And he said they could have to guess the rest. These things, however, may have gone against him in his relations with the general public. During the 1930s, those of us who had been coming to his meetings for some time were asked to bring all our friends without selection to a series of talks about consciousness. People would arrive to find written on the board, psychology as the study of objective consciousness. And he would introduce the subject and then stop. Sometimes he completely altered what he was going to say. And when we asked him why, he said, how could I say any of that with those people there? But that man with the black beard, I could talk to him. Once he made me go and fetch out 3 people who were sitting looking particularly silly and conspicuous in the front row. So although scores of people came, when we complained to him that only about 10% remained, he said, that's a good proportion. The majority of people are not interested. These lectures of his were preparatory. He would feel his way and find what was of interest. And only when he got them into their final form, were they printed privately by Fairfax Hall under his direction. Later they were published after his death and really without his approval, because he showed us that he had discovered very much more since those tentative days. Naturally, the reactions of all these people were many and various. Once I introduced to his lectures a very high-spirited lady who, after a month, came and said to me, I'm not coming anymore. You're all just pale shadows of Mr. Ouspensky. Nothing alive, nothing of your own. When I told him, he said, she's quite right. You should see a bit of her. It would be good for you. with that attitude, criticizing people instead of listening, she couldn't be expected to go far. He was much amused because later in New York, the atmosphere at his meetings was so different from that in London. Instead of the silences, there was a hubbub of conversation so that he could scarcely get a hearing. He enjoyed both types of meeting, however, but one had to be genuine. Once I asked him a question at one of those meetings. He said, "How dare you ask a question? You ought to come up here and answer all these questions yourself." Obviously he saw that it was a put-up question. Coming from personality. During World War II in New York, many people, about 800 all told, came to his meetings, but as before, very few got as far as getting to Mendon and working on the farm. He gave, at that time, a very free exposition of his whole system and all his ideas. Of which Yale have the available records. Later, especially when his health began to fail, he would often say, "Take meeting for me tonight." When asked what the subject was, he would be monosyllabic. For example, activities of man with particular reference to crime. One sat long hours with him trying to pick up his thought and understand something about what one was supposed to be going to talk about. In all our dealings with him at that time, it was evident that we were meant to learn more and more how to communicate with him without words. Evident because of the pamphlets and books he lent one to read, all concerned with what is now known as extrasensory perception, ESP. The experiments on card reading at Duke University, proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, and theosophical writings of various kinds. One time I went into his room and said, "I had a marvelous dream last night." And he looked up and said, "Dr. Freud, it wasn't a dream." And then told me what I was intending to tell him. Part 2, private conversations. Many were the magical talks we had with him, a few of us, both by day and by night. They were of all kinds, according to his mood and the responsiveness of the people with him. A few remain in my mind of his reminiscences of his life in Moscow, and in Russia. Two from pre-revolutionary days when he was editor of a Moscow newspaper. One evening, a novelist friend dashed into his office in a very disheveled state. "Two of my characters," he said, "insist on getting married when I try to keep them apart. They're spoiling my book. Lend me a revolver." "So," said Ouspensky, I lent him two of the revolvers I had with me. After about 2 hours, he came back even more disheveled. "I asked you for a revolver," he said dismally. "You gave me 2 revolvers. What can I do with 2 revolvers?" One time in Odessa, an English colonel prospecting for open-cast coal and wanting some press backing invited him to his hotel. It was a sweltering hot day, and the colonel never even offered him a drink. If he had, we could not only have done business, but he would have been interested in the system. As it was, he had to wait 20 years. The colonel, then a brigadier, was present in 1932 when he told this story and admitted his lapse most regretfully. At these talks, which usually went on all night, he would often reserve till about 7 o'clock in the morning the most important things, see if anyone had stayed awake. Sometimes these were very exacting. One had then, without sleep, to go to Madam's room and try to recount what had gone on. I remember on one occasion, with another doctor, we sat up for 2 nights running. And when we went off back to London by car to do our day's work, he stood and shouted after us, "Accidents must not happen." Incidentally, though we had plenty of vodka and wine, we were never allowed to get drunk. He would ask, "What is the difference between drinking with me and drinking in the ordinary way?" The following account is given by one narrator of a time when he was just beginning to have these all-night conversations. Love your enemy. Love your enemies. During 1933, I had been rereading William James's Variety of Religious Experiences, and had been much struck by the chapter in which James said that if a few people really understood and could carry out the precept, "Love your enemies," they might well seem superhuman beings and might conceivably transform the world. Page 283. Several times we had asked, questions as to what this meant, love your enemies. But had been met with such remarks as, far, far away, too far from us. We cannot use the word love. Too many things are called by this word. But one night in June of that year, they happened to be sitting alone in the dining room at the country house in Surrey. They spent the early evening talking about many things, but around midnight, I returned to these words and said something about how everything would be different if we could love our enemies. O said, you don't know what this means. First of all, have you got any enemies? I thought for a bit and mumbled, I can't think of any just at this moment, but I'm sure I've had enemies. He said, no, serious enemies, I mean. If I had an enemy, I'd shoot him. I mean somebody you would want to shoot. I admit it. So-and-so annoys me very much, and I'm sure she hates me, but it hasn't occurred to me to shoot her. Perhaps because our relations change all the time. Sometimes we quite like each other. That's it, he almost shouted. Such as we are, we change too much. We're all the time changing. We cannot even have enemies. One minute we like, the next minute we hate. But a lunatic with idée fixe, he can have enemies, and he can shoot them. He let this sink in for a time and told her to think about our position, why we can't have enemies, and yet how strange it was that the gospel told us to love our enemies. Then we tried some vintage Bordeaux. He ceased to be serious for an hour or two and refused to return to the subject, which I promptly forgot all about. Around midnight, he went out of the room for perhaps half an hour and came back in a very different mood. He found fault with everything, appeared to be in a very bad temper, wouldn't let R have any more wine because even beer is too good for you. Finally, when R asked him a question that he had saved up, thinking it was very intelligent, he told him that it was useless to talk with somebody who had no understanding at all, and R had better go off and amuse himself some other way. By this time, R was quite furious and glared at him murderously. O met his gaze and said quietly, now do you want to shoot me? Yes, said I believe I could. Now am I your enemy? I gasped and said, I begin to see. O opened another bottle of wine. Now he began slowly. We can speak again about this strange expression, love your enemies. Such as we are, we have no enemies. We have friends whom we should love, but sometimes we want to murder them. He mentioned some mutual acquaintances, and then your wife, for instance, you love her, but she knows by now ways to make you very angry when she wants to. I agreed feelingly. O became serious. Then suppose a man who has knowledge. You come to him, he tells you, before you can know all that, you must be changed. And for that, you must accept certain conditions. You agree. He establishes a special relation with you. Suppose he treats you badly. He shows you some weakness, and you're angry, and suspicious. How can you change anything if he who is your friend can seem to be your enemy? Love your enemies can only have a meaning in a school. It has no meaning for mankind in general. Man cannot love even his friends. Nobody loves, they only love themselves. I asked, how can one learn to do this then? He said, much has to come first. But what can you try to do? You can try to reason with yourself, to prepare yourself. Then when I speak to you, you can try not to express your feelings. And you can try to keep thoughts from turning about it. But you will not for a long time be able to love. I thought much about this conversation. It so happened that the next evening it had been arranged that he would bring a friend to dine with O at Scott's restaurant at the top of Haymarket in London. He was a very special friend, and we had some very special lobster and good hock. Later he left, and H, much senior to R, joined us. After a little there was a pause, and O turned to R and said, "Tell him what we talked of last night." R said hurriedly, like reciting a lesson, "We spoke of the expression, love your enemies. It doesn't mean anything to us because we don't have enemies. We're to..." "Stop, stop," cried O. "It was never like that. You say it all in one sentence, but we spoke the whole evening." And he began slowly to reconstruct the conversation, expressing each conclusion we came to. Of course, it carried quite different weight and emphasis. The next day, I wrote down this account just as it stands here. "12 years have gone by, years full of drama for R or anyone who was in the company of O. In London and Paris before World War II, at 9 placed with nightly bombings during the Battle of Britain, and later, during the war, on long visits to New York and New Jersey. Now the war is over. O has come back to line with a few friends from the States, obviously a very ill man with only a few months to live. One of his first acts was to call R and another man and ask them to collect 300 people. "What should we do?" asked R. "See them in groups and prepare them." "What should we say to them?" "Why say anything? Ask them what they want." Within 3 weeks, the 300 people were collected at College House for the last 3 meetings it was to hold. This again was a chance to practice what was taught about understanding what he wanted without any verbal communication. For R sat below the platform with his back to it and maintained the conversation, allowing O to say something whenever he wanted to. It was clear already that everything had split up by this time and people were going different ways. The system had already been abandoned by many. O spent the remaining months of his life preparing a few people to reconstruct the teaching for use after he died, and also in seeing, by invitation, people who had played a part in his life. One of them was a school fellow of his who plays a part in his novel for the cinema, Strange Life of Ivan Osokin, which of all his books I believe I most wanted to be remembered by. During the summer, Madame Ouspensky, knowing him to be dying, wanted him back under her care, but had grave doubts as to whether, in that case, he would enjoy the freedom necessary for the intensive work on himself which he had always believed to be necessary as a preparation for death. So when August came, passages had been booked for a party of 6 people, including him, on the Queen Mary. We'd driven to Southampton Docks. The Cunard had given us a special permit to drive the car right up under the bows of the great ship. All our luggage was on board, but suddenly he realized that he must not go. Various people tried to persuade him to get out of the car, but he refused. So I got in and said, "What do you want to do, Mr. Ouspensky? Do you want to go back to life?" He said, "Yes." Some got out and went onto the ship. It was the parting of the ways. But 2 or 3 got into the car and we drove back to life. Soon after this, he became very ill with a high temperature, shivers, and a renal abscess. He said one day, "Give me a month to live." So getting my old school friend, who was the local general practitioner, and already well known to Ouspensky from a 3-month visit he made to New York, we planned a course of penicillin injections. Dr. C reminds me of O's instinctive terror of allowing himself to be in the hands of doctors, and how he got out of bed and cowered in a corner at the sight of the advancing figure with a syringe. However, we coaxed him back to bed. I held him down while Dr. C gave the injections. Quite soon he realized they were not painful and let us proceed without opposition. Suddenly he took a turn for the better. The penicillin really worked. From that time, we never had a moment's peace. Out all day in the car and most of the night, very irregular meals, if any. He really showed what strength of will meant in putting his body through all this hardship. I remember on one occasion towards midnight, feeling stiff and cold and hungry, and being stirred to the very depths of indignation. But suddenly an echo of that old conversation about love your enemies came to my mind. And I remembered that I had agreed to accept that relationship with him, that I would love him whatever he did. It seemed then that something happened, something changed in one. And it was not coincidence that minutes later Earl began to unfold his plans for the reconstruction of the system and the continuation of his work. The day before his death, we went for a car drive, and he told us all this, beginning with the words, "I had to move you from where you were. Now I can speak." Next day he called everybody staying in the house to the drawing room and told us to outline the plans. Looking round, with the sun pouring in, looking round at all the people, the last words he ever uttered were, "Yes, personal people, all personal people." Soon after, he had a final rigor, lost consciousness, and we carried him up to bed. He died at 6 the next morning without having recovered consciousness, though one could feel sitting up with him that a tremendous struggle was going on. The 4 eyewitnesses were convinced that he had finally accomplished, before his death, all that he had intended. Shortly afterwards, I went to Mendham, where he listened to readings from the book Fragments of an Unknown Teaching. At the end of his visit, Madame told him of her plan to publish the book, now called In Search of the Miraculous, and invite G to visit them, and asked for his comments. He answered, "No comment. Mr. Ouspensky told us you would do that. It's all far above my head, and we just have to do what we were told to do." Someone who was present with Gurdjieff when the news of O's death reached him told us that he sat silent for a long time, looking into the distance, then said, "I am supposed to hate Ouspensky, but he wrote fragments, so I loved him." A debt had been repaid. When he himself died less than a year later, we remembered him with profound gratitude, for without him, none of that magnificent teaching would have reached PD Ouspensky and the West.